Good morning, everyone. If I could have your attention, please. Thank you very much. Good morning. My name's David Grant. I'm Associate Dean for Research at the University of Sydney Business School. And on behalf of the school, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this morning's Powered by Research breakfast briefing. This is the seventh of in our programme of breakfast get-togethers, and we started the programme in 2009. It's proven to be enormously successful. Certainly, this is one of the larger of those gatherings to date, and these kinds of events provide the school with an opportunity to engage with the various stakeholders in our research. And more specifically, they allow us to tell you about the latest developments in research activities in the school and allow you to raise and discuss key issues that are of relevance and importance to you and your organisation. And of course, transportation is something that will be of central interest to everyone in this room. Among our guests today, we have people from various industry sectors, from government, from professional bodies and from the media. It's terrific to see you all, and thank you for taking the time to join us. A warm welcome to some of our Masters of Management industry partners and a number of our EMBA students. Now, aside from allowing us to tell you about the latest developments in school research, the other great value of these gatherings is that they've served to really strengthen our links with our alumni and also as an opportunity for our alumni to also network. And that's demonstrated by the fact that there are a sizable number of our alumni with us today, and we're delighted that you're here, and thank you again for your support. Well, the school seeks to carry out research that's of that has theoretical and methodological rigour, but most importantly it's of impact and relevance to end users. And we're looking to do research that really informs practice, policy and regulation, both nationally and internationally, and which leads really to our staff being regarded as public intellectuals in Australia and the global arena. And the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies exemplifies this. By way of background, the Institute was established at the university in 1995. Its director is Professor David Hensher, and under David's leadership, the Institute's grown to comprise about 20 full-time staff, including 3 full professors, all of whom are internationally recognised in their respective areas of expertise, these being Professors Corinne Mully, David Waters and Peter Stouffer. And in addition, the Institute is is a regular host to numerous distinguished visiting and honorary staff. Now, the ITLS really does represent a remarkable success story for us. It's genuinely world-renowned for the work it does, and as it's developed, it's become integral to our teaching and our research portfolios. Moreover, it does provide, I think, a real distinctiveness to our intellectual brand, and it gives us an important edge, you might argue, to some of our competitors. The fact is that relatively few business schools globally, let alone in Australia, have the kind of research expertise in transportation and logistics that we have in the ITLS. But when you consider the significance of transport and logistics to the economy and to the business activity that we're all engaged in this room, it's a no-brainer, really, to have a unit like the ITLS as part of your business school portfolio, and we're pleased that we do. Staff in the ITLS are highly active researchers. They produce quality research in the areas of transportation and logistics. Members of the group regularly feature in the top academic and practitioner journals in their fields, and they receive widespread recognition for their work. But what's also impressive about ITLS is the very strong links with the business, professional and other bodies, and of course government, that it's developed. Indeed, the spread of guests at this morning's breakfast is in part a testimony to those links. And these links have resulted in research grants, consultancy projects, and other forms of engagement that really underpin the relevance and the impact of the research that ITLS do. And I should also say that these links and the quality of the Institute's research feed into and inform its teaching programmes, enabling it to produce some very high-class graduates that are sought after by a range of premier employers in the business and other sectors. Okay, so on to today's programme. As you may have gathered from the programme on your tables, a little later we're going to hear from Professor David Hensher. David's regarded as one of Australia's most eminent transport academics, and he's in constant demand as an advisor to industry and government. He's going to talk about his latest research on urban transportation, and in doing so he's going to urge a little less conversation and a little more action. David will also be a member of this morning's discussion panel, rather than conversation, I guess, which will convene once he's finished speaking. I'd just like to take a moment to mention the other panellists, and on behalf of the school, thank them for being prepared to come along this morning and really work for their breakfast. First of all, I'd like to welcome our MC for the morning, Helen Daly. Helen is a highly respected reporter, a journalist, an interviewer, who's regularly appeared on a range of current and business affairs programmes, including the 9 Network's Today Show, Sunday and A Current Affair. She now works for Sky News Australia and the Sky News Business Channel, where she presents, for example, Sunday Agenda, Sunday Business, and also the Business View. Helen's standing in her profession is evidenced by the many awards that she's won over the years, and I'll not list them all. It would take some time. But she's received the coveted Walkley Award for excellence in broadcast journalism, and other notable awards from the United Nations, the Media Peace Award and the Michael Daly Award for Best Television Feature and Documentary. Helen, we're delighted that you can act as our MC today, and thank you for doing so. Helen will also introduce other panel members more formally later, and she'll facilitate the discussion with panellists and guests. But I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly thank Paul Forward of Evans and Peck, and also Andrew West from the Sydney Morning Herald. We're grateful to them both for their time and for their willingness to help solve Sydney's transportation problems this morning. A final few other thank yous. Basically, thank you to Alison Avery and the rest of the team from MER, who along with their colleagues in ITLS have put this wonderful event together. In a moment, we'll allow you some time to eat and chat, and then David will give his presentation, and following on from that, Helen will convene the panel for discussion and for some questions from the floor. We should conclude our proceedings by about 9 o'clock. Finally, once again, it remains me to thank you all for coming, and I very much hope that you enjoy the morning. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to this wonderful Powered by Research breakfast. My name's Helen Daly and I'm delighted to be here to guide us through this morning. I think it's fantastic that this is happening, particularly at this time. I think after we've got a new government, there's a new focus on transport, and there's a lot of talk around the city, around the state, really around the country, about all types of issues to do with transport, public transport, private transport, roads, rail, all sorts of things, buses, etc. So it's perfect. It's a perfect opportunity today to get stuck into these sorts of issues, and I'm really delighted at our panellists. But we're going to hear first, before I introduce the panellists, we're going to hear from Professor David Hensher, and I'm very excited to hear what he has to say. As David said before, he's the leading voice, I suppose, in transport that many governments go to. He's Professor of Management and founding director of the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies. And that really is the key centre of teaching and research in transport management in the University of Sydney Business School. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. He's a recipient of the 2009 International Association of Travel Behaviour Research Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition for his long-standing contribution to that body, as well as to the wider travel behaviour community. And this seems to be his real bent. How do we all travel? Why do we want to travel that way? And how can governments and private enterprises make that happen for us? He's a member of the Singapore Land Transport Authority International Advisory Panel, which is chaired by the Minister of Transport, and he's past president of the International Association of Travel Behaviour Research. He's on the editorial boards of 10 of the leading transport journals. He's area editor of Transport Reviews. He's published extensively on these different subjects, over 475 papers in leading international transport and economics journals, as well as 12 books. He's Australia's most cited transport expert. Transport expert, yes. It is a little bit early, but I have no excuse, really. His particular interests are transport economics, transport strategy, sustainable transport, productivity measurement, this traveller behaviour analysis, choice analysis, stated choice experiments and institutional reform. He's advised numerous government and private sector organisations on matters. Look, he's very excited to be He's advising this present government, and he's got all sorts of things to tell us. So without further ado, please welcome Professor David Hensher on urban transport. A little less conversation, a little more action.
Thank you, Helen. I hope after my talk I am not exported, but it's wonderful to be here to see such a large number of people. This is fantastic from all walks of life and commitment. Here, and especially a welcome to the Consular General from Japan. It's nice to have you here. The title is fairly clear. I have a lot to cover, but hopefully I'll cover it in a way that creates sufficient interest, a little bit of controversy, and hopefully will then move the agenda forward as New South Wales is opening itself to these great new opportunities to be the first state in infrastructure reform, as Nick Greiner described it the other day. There will always be some continuing themes. The success of reform means to be consistent with what you believe in the context of setting a vision and working to achieve it. More conversation, less action means no more plan 1, plan 2, plan 3, but a plan to move forward. And I think the important thing I want to start off by saying is that whatever we do, we must recognise that Sydney is a metropolitan area and not a stack of corridors, and it has a network and a system that needs to be served. And I have the statement I make these days is that we should focus on networks and systems and not projects and corridors, but recognise that projects and corridors serve networks, and that is the basis on which we decide if they are indeed value added. I also like to say, whenever I'm talking about reform, that there are some very key words that we should remind all about when you're focusing on improvements, particularly in infrastructure, and that is connectivity, frequency and visibility. Visibility is an important issue because we know where the railway stations are, we often don't know where the bus stops are. And I think public transport now has risen to the fore, even though currently it caters for less than 13% of all trips in Sydney on a daily basis, despite the dominance of the peak into the city, which is 80%. Nevertheless, Sydney shouldn't be seen as a CBD-centric metropolitan area, but indeed one as described as a city of cities. And that's an important reminder about where we put our investment. I'll talk briefly about some of the funding sources, and increasingly want to talk about the role of user pays and the old adage, to make the public transport more attractive, you must make the car less attractive. So what do public stakeholders think about transportation? We run a quarterly survey at the Institute through the business school called TOPS, Transport Opinion Survey, and each quarter we get opinions from around the country. One slide I want to share with you, which has been consistent through each quarter, each bar being a quarter, is that public transport improvements rise to the fore in addition to roads. So when you put those two together, you've got close to 80% of all the first priority issues being cited as improvements in public transport and improvements in roads. These clearly are not independent because buses use roads. One thing I do want to say, though, is that when we are considering public transport, there's a great debate and dilemma about what form of public transport. And it comes down to, in my opinion, to two very simple points: coverage and or patronage, which is linked to frequency. This is a very good diagram to send home the message that if you over-focus on certain parts of the system, you run the risk of neglecting the rest of the system. This is a dilemma, but we have to put it in the context of the goals that we're interested in. And these goals are not necessarily independent, but we have patronage goals, which clearly government's interested in financial returns and environmental benefits of getting people out of the car by growing patronage. At the same sense, we need coverage. Coverage is where we focus on the broader issues of social inclusion, which of course is a hot issue for the Prime Minister right now on the news this morning. And it does have impacts on an ageing population, senior mobility, disabled mobility, other special needs. And also the equity issue. We pay our taxes too, we need a choice. We need a choice that isn't limited just the car or nothing. But importantly note that coverage can also deliver patronage. So just returning to this slide here, this is an important slide to think about where we go in the future. If we focus on individual corridors, we run the risk of losing coverage. We may get high patronage, but are they in the right place? And this then leads to a question which I believe globally is being asked, but maybe not being asked in Sydney to the extent that it should be. And that is, can rail deliver the same service capacity, frequency, flexibility and connectivity per dollar that, say, alternatives like bus rapid transit can deliver. I'm quite surprised, but in some ways maybe not so surprised, when people say, what is bus rapid transit? It actually looks like a railway, smells like a railway, and acts like a railway. It's like the Brisbane bus system. It's a totally dedicated road network where only buses use it and high service capacity, and it doesn't have to compete with the car. And that has been the historical dilemma of the bus in mixed traffic, which has given it a terrible name. But I think the time has come to ask ourselves, where are we going to get value for money? By building more railways or going to BRT? And BRT systems are burgeoning all over the world as an alternative to heavy rail in contexts where the densities of the origin destinations are low. I have to say, despite what some say, Sydney is a very low density city when it comes to origins and destination links. It might have a few high density origins and it might have a few high density destinations, but that's not the issue. The issue is the connectivity, and it's the density of the corridors that matters. And I ask you the question to think about as to whether we need to build heavy rail to actually deliver the outcomes we aspire to. Despite the fact that the current government is committed to some railways, and I do understand that, I'm politically savvy, but nevertheless the question must still be asked. And no doubt it's a question that will be asked to Nick Greiner as the Chair of Infrastructure New South Wales. So service capacity is what matters, not vehicle capacity or train set capacity. And it's very interesting to see around the world, as time goes by, how much capacity you can deliver per passenger hour in each direction by alternatives. Let me not say, or rather let me emphasise that I'm not negative towards railways. I'm not any more than I'm positive towards buses. But what I do want to say is I want the right technical solution to the problem at hand. And the problem at hand should be based on some broad objectives to do with value added, efficiency, social equity and so on. And so let's not talk about the mode, but talk about what transport in the form of public transport can deliver. And when it comes to value for money, which is a great buzzword that's used by many these days, what do we mean? I'm not exactly sure most of the time, but I like to think that for every dollar that's spent, especially taxpayers' dollar, we're getting more for it. And this is just a slide to illustrate how much money you could spend on different systems, given that we've got a fixed budget. And it's a very powerful diagram, which I must say some years ago when I showed it to the then leader of the opposition, now the Premier, he got very excited about that diagram. I'm hoping he still is. However, to make public transport more attractive, as I said, requires making the car less attractive. And although I'm focusing today mainly on passenger transport, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about on pricing must roll over to heavy vehicles versus on the roads versus rail in metropolitan areas. But the biggest challenge I think we face is congestion and its cost. We know, based on lost travel time, it's costing in Australia something like $24 billion by 2020. But if you look at the USA, we're talking about $115 billion by 2009, a huge cost to society in the form of delay due to congestion. And often to bring home the point, we would put it into a language that's very appealing, like in the USA, this is associated with 3.9 billion gallons of wasted fuel, which is 130 days of flow from the Alaska pipeline. That is a waste of money, and it's due to the growth of congestion, which is very much linked to the popularity of the car, the unpopularity of alternatives, but in particularly the huge underpricing of the car relative to what it should be. And this led to the Henry Tax Review when Ken Henry said this is one of the major areas of weakness in the way we price our public utilities. We do a better job with water and electricity, but we do an appalling job with the roads. So the pricing solution must not leave the agenda, but it's a very emotional agenda when it comes to pricing. I've been involved in action plans with government where we draft a chapter on pricing, and then when the report is released, it normally ends up as a removed chapter with a footnote saying pricing is important for another day. Now, sadly, it is laden with emotion, and unfortunately, whenever I'm asked to talk about congestion charging or road pricing, it hits the media as another congestion tax and assumes it's added on to all existing taxes and charges. And so I really think we've got to be a lot more responsible in the way we explain what it is we want to do to reform pricing. And I think that the opportunity is there to reform pricing without necessarily simply adding on another charge on top of the existing charges. And so we have to ask ourselves, how can we do this so that people can actually be better off? And unless you can sell it as a benefit to the society, it's going to be impossible to convert politicians to show a great deal of interest. But the world is listening. The world is listening primarily because they're running out of money to maintain roads, and they're looking to other sources to fund public transport and other sustainable transport solutions. And what we have to do is not only tidy up the language, but also to identify an alternative charging regime that's going to be fairer. And that will include charging for congestion. And I have to say, when people say to me, well, it's not fair, I then put the point is, well, how fair is the existing system? Why should we all pay the same registration fee for a class of vehicle when we all travel different annual kilometres on the roads at locations where congestion varies from nothing to significant? We'd all, and when we're sitting round in a party and discussing this, would say, yes, you're right, but don't do it. Real road pricing reform must involve dropping some charges. So it's a wholesale reform of everything. And it does involve seriously thinking about what we're going to do with existing registration charges and existing fuel taxes. And there are some parts of the world that are taking this much more seriously. Do not start discussing congestion charging without putting in the context of reform on all the other charging. It's the only way you're going to sell it. And I have to say the media must be more responsible with its words. And in future, when I talk to the media, and my great friend Andrew West, I'll be making sure it's put into this context. After all, time is money. This is an amazing issue. When I was told by a previous minister in a previous government that roads are free, that person is actually saying we declare that people don't value their time. And you'd wonder when people complain about all the delays. It's such a hot issue. I'm sure some of you complained today about getting here, although coming at this time of the day is a bonus because there's not many cars on the road if you came by car. But we would wonder sometimes when people complain about these delays but will not support possible ways of aiding improved travel time. Now, most of you are commuters, and I know that on average your value of travel time savings for all commuters is $16 an hour in Sydney. I suspect you're at the upper echelon, you're most likely on higher incomes, so I suspect most of you are worth at least $30 per hour, so thank you for your 90 minutes today. We are trying to do something about this in the Institute. We have a 3-year Australian Research Council grant to actually look at this whole issue of how do you sell road pricing reform back to the constituency. And a lot of it's got to do with how you spend the revenue. It's not just a matter of what is the charge, but what do you do with the money? And it's been proven around the world, if this money can be fed back into convincing causes like improved public transport or environmentally sustainable solutions, you've got more chance of selling it. We know the market price serves as an investment signal. And indeed, in the USA, it's very interesting that using a constrained benefit cost ratio of 1, if you looked at the interstate system in the USA and actually put on an optimal charge for the use of the roads in terms of congestion reduction, there'd be actually a saving of $47 billion of benefits per year. That's benefits. Now, what's interesting about this, for those who have been around for at least 40 years plus in this industry, that nothing is new at all. This was a topic discussed back in Britain in the famous Smead report 40 years ago about introducing road pricing. In those days, we did not have the technology, and it was always used as the excuse. The technology is there now. We can collect any data at any time, and privacy issues have been in the main resolved. So there is interest growing. There's interest growing in many countries. I've just listed a few. Some of them have done it to varying degrees. Others are in the process of implementing a form of congestion charging, admittedly, mainly in the central business district. I have to say in Sydney, I'm very keen to introduce that in the CBD, but I think it'll have little impact other than to demonstrate that politicians accept it. The benefits would be minor. You have to do it for the system as a whole. So a quick little ride through slides. Surprising that an economist would use slides, but I find they're informative. This is London, where they introduced one of the first congestion charging schemes, a fixed charge to go into London at certain hours, which is now up to about £12 per day. Stockholm, this one, by the way, was just a flat charge. Stockholm then introduced it a few years later, but by time of day, putting a cordon around the CBD. Singapore, which was ahead of the game, but sadly, most people would say if you can do it in Singapore, you most likely can't do it anywhere else, but times have changed, and indeed Singapore has done the same thing with electronic road pricing by time of day and by entry point. In the USA, we're starting to see this happen on specific roads. It's not strictly road pricing in terms of a system. It's a road-specific treatment, but it is directional, and it is by time of day, and it's by day of the week. So we're starting to get a little bit more sophisticated. And in the Interstate 15 in Southern California, it's dynamic and it's adjusted according to the build-up of traffic in a previous period. In other words, that is true efficient pricing. It's unfortunate that diagram on the left suggests they've overcharged. But be that as it may, I haven't yet found one where they've got the price right. But, you know, at least something's happening. And in Germany, being sick and tired of people registering cars in Croatia and then getting the benefits of the autobahns in Germany to sell their wares in Poland and Holland, they've introduced through GPS a charging system for heavy vehicles. So there are many, many ways in which we could do this, and I think these are just by way of examples. We'd like to think a distance-based charging regime is the way to go to satisfy the objectives of not only financing infrastructure, to improving accessibility, to alleviating congestion, and of course to reduce externalities like emissions. We've been doing some interesting work with GHD Merrick for the National Transport Commission on looking at 16 pricing regimes on 15 classes of vehicles. I can't tell you what the answers are at the moment. This is politically very hot stuff, but there's a view that we need to move away from a pay-go pricing regime to a distance-based charging stream related to mass and location. So we need a network migration to variable charging, and we must continue to push this if you believe that the future of efficient, sustainable public transport must recognise the challenges we face in getting people out of their cars. And although many people will tell me that we cannot possibly do this until we have a good public transport system, I throw out the challenge that I think the switching will be quite small, regardless. But the amount of revenue we can generate can be fantastic to do something quite substantial. And even if we can increase public transport modal share from 12% to 15%, that is a massive increase in public transport use for a small adjustment in car use. So we need to seriously consider how we're going to do this, and I've learned in recent years that one way we might be able to achieve this more easily is to sell the environmental benefits of renewed charging through the externalities like reducing pollution and emissions, and at the same time get some congestion outcomes as well. So it's how do we sell this? This is not about economics or engineering anymore. This is about politics and marketing. It's all about politics and marketing. We know what to do. How do we actually change the process? And there are good examples around the world where people are trying to do this. The Oregon Proof of Concept program and the Dutch study. And I'll briefly mention the Dutch study, which is currently deferred through a change of government, so it's politics at work again. But it's recognising that you must look at the network as a whole, because there's a real risk if you do this on individual roads, it has a negative overall benefit on the welfare of the system as a whole. And you've only got to see what happens when you build toll roads and the degradation of the competing roads as a consequence. Not going to say why, but it's observed. The Dutch are innovative. Sadly, there was a change of government and it's been deferred, but fortunately not abandoned, whereby they said we scrap the entire annual fixed registration charges and purchase price of vehicles, sales prices and so on, taxes, and we're going to introduce a kilometre-based charge which is related to distance and location and emissions eventually. In other words, if you have a gas-guzzling car and you travel in high congestion areas in certain times of the day, you will possibly pay more annually on using your car than somebody who has a clean fueled vehicle of some description or low energy emissions, who travels in a non-congested environment, is likely to pay less than they currently pay. We've done the calculations, and I can tell you that over 60% of people could be better off depending on what assumption you make about the cost per kilometre. So in other words, there are winners and losers. You have to understand, though, that the losers are actually people getting a time benefit. So in that sense, they're not strictly losers, but financially they could be worse off. In Sydney, we believe many people will be far better off because they're paying imposts for an inefficient system that they're not actually contributing to. And those who contributed to it should be those that should pay. So how do people respond to road pricing? We're obviously very interested in this. This is the travel behaviour stuff that was mentioned by Helen. Do people change their departure time? Do they change their mode? You know, we don't have a peak in Sydney anymore. It's peak spreading has been the main solution to congestion, not modal switching. But I don't know when the peak starts, you tell me, and sometimes it starts at 6 and sometimes and ends at 11. So in other words, the 1 hour peak that people often talk about is an absolute nonsense. Nevertheless, there are short-term responses, there are medium-term responses, which are partly related to location, and there are long-term responses. We need to understand all these phenomena. We do know, though, that road pricing can deliver good outcomes, not only in terms of transport switching, but land use outcomes. And so we must recognise this, and unfortunately there are views out there, well, we can't do any of this, as I've said, unless we can extensively invest in public transport. I think the switch will be quite small, and I think there are scare tactics out there saying, let's not do any of it because the public transport system would not cope. Some years ago I was told by one of the major public transport providers in Sydney, we are opposed to road pricing because our network can't handle it when they all switch. I don't think it'll happen to the extent we assume. So, a really interesting point. I write a regular piece for the Australian Bus and Coach magazine. Every month I'm asked to give a piece on food for thought, and then I have to think about what's the topic this week. Well, it occurred to me last week that I said to myself, how many buses could a heavy rail project buy? I thought, what an interesting question. How many buses could a heavy rail project buy? So I did some calculations on an assumed average price of a bus. Doesn't matter if this is slightly wrong. Nevertheless, given what I think the North West Rail project is going to cost, and please double the cost because it will be, and the same for the South West Railway, we always know you double the costs and you half the patronage and you're getting close to the truth, is that amazingly the current 4,000 buses in Sydney would increase to 18,250 if we didn't build the North West Railway and put in buses. And if we didn't build the South West, we'd have a 28,500 buses equivalent in cost. And that would be a 7-fold increase in buses. And when I said this to someone the other day, how much connectivity and frequency and penetration could you get with that? 7-fold increase in buses. Now then, of course, people will say, well, that'll be a disaster on the roads. They come to a halt. Would this make traffic congestion worse? Well, I don't actually think it will, because I think this service level will be so gargantuan, it will get people out of their cars. It will start treating seriously what origin, destination, connectivity and frequency really means. And you've only got to look to Brisbane for a little bit of a clue about that, where frequency and connectivity has caused a 65% growth in a certain location, admittedly, in Brisbane in the last 5 years. And so this is a really interesting issue. It delivers frequency, it delivers connectivity, and it delivers coverage. Do individual railway projects in individual corridors do the same thing? That's my question. So I'm going to finish with some challenges, which I'm not expecting the panel to reply to them, but they were the ones that I set. Will we ever be able to attract enough people out of the car by any amount of injection of investment into public transport to relieve congestion on our roads? It's a very important question. It must be answered because it's been used as an argument about don't do anything much on the roads in terms of pricing until we have this massive injection into public transport. So, and if the answer is yes, what sort of investment might we need? And remembering Sydney is a city of cities. It is a network, it's not a project and it's not a corridor. And this does raise some more fundamental questions about public-private partnerships, by the way, because the private bit likes projects. Is that a downside in delivering network benefits? What role should a revamp of the price of using the car play in traffic congestion relieved future? So we need to sort out this pricing challenge in terms of congestion charge, but we need to remove the emotion of the language. The emotion of the language is a real hindrance, and I, amongst other colleagues of mine, are starting to write on how you interpret words to create benefits rather than to create confusion and negativity. And I believe all this applies equally to heavy vehicles as well, and one of the big challenges we're going to face is what do we do about heavy vehicles, but especially light commercials. I'm sure you've all travelled on Sydney roads in recent months to know that almost half the vehicles between 6 in the morning and 8 are these light commercials, the plumbers, the electricians and so on. Big challenges to what we do about facilitating their involvement in the traffic as well. But the good news is you can charge the appropriate price to all forms of transportation, but you must spend the money you get wisely. Thank you.
David, if he wouldn't mind taking a seat at the main table. David, thank you very much for that. So much food for thought, and I'm sorry that we had to sort of limit you. There was so many good issues, but we'll talk about some of them now. It now gives me pleasure to introduce our panel, and if they could come up as well, you can have a microphone each so you don't have to share them, and we'll have a real conversation. Andrew West is one of our panellists. He is a reporter from the Sydney Morning Herald. He specialises now in urban affairs. He was transport writer for a long time and he knows these issues. He is very interested in these issues that have been talked about today. He's been a big blogger, but now I understand that's in hiatus, Andrew. He's authored 2 political books, including a biography on the former Premier Bob Carr. He's also been a journalist with the Australian and the Sun Herald. Please welcome him briefly. And our other panellist this morning we're pleased to have is Paul Forward. Now, Paul is well known to many of you. He's the former CEO of the RTA, the Roads and Traffic Authority, from 1999 to 2005. Before that, he was the RTA's Director of Road Network Infrastructure. He has extensive experience in the public sector, including also in the Water Board in the old days, and in most areas of management. Paul's been an economics lecturer. He has graduate qualifications in economics and town planning. He's now principal at Evans and Peck Consultancy, and he is also on the advisory board of the ITLS. Welcome to all of you. Now let's get down to it. Paul, if I can ask you first, I know you have some thoughts on what David presented. What are those thoughts about the challenges or any of the issues that he raised?
Thanks, Helen. When I looked at David's slides, I guess a few words came to my mind. Firstly, courageous, in the true Yes Minister sense. Brave, but also timely. Timely in a number of ways. I don't know whether people saw Peter Shergold's comments yesterday in the Education Supplement to the Australian. But he's talking about the lack of relevance of academic research in terms of public policy. Well, I think this challenges that assumption, what David's doing today, and I think that's very timely that the Sydney University should have a forum like this to input into such a very important public policy debate. But the other word that came to my mind was déjà vu. Like David said, I've also been involved in a number of transport plans, long-term transport plans, and have helped prepare some of those with other people in this room. And the word road pricing always gets a chapter, and then, as David said, it gets reduced. The words go from implement, deliver road pricing, to consider, form a working party, to a footnote. And I think that illustrates how difficult politically this issue actually is and how important it is to have a proper public debate about it that doesn't use the emotive language of yet another big new tax, which I'm sure we're going to see in the debate. But it also reminds me of a debate that happened in the water industry during the post-war period, when people may recall that water pricing, domestic water, was based on your property value. Therefore, if you lived close to the city, you paid more for water than if you lived on the fringe of the city, because your property values were lower on the fringe. And hence, people had no incentive to save water. They had no incentive to report leaks. And people had this argument that, we couldn't change water. We always had to charge as we did with water, because if we charged the proper price for water, then shock horror, people wouldn't shower and we'd have all sorts of health problems. Well, of course, it didn't happen. And we now expect to charge for water, and we have a proper user pay system for water, although it's still some way to go. So I think we've got that same emotional language in the whole debate about road pricing. I also like to point out David's point about looking at networks. Yes, we continue to focus on projects, and it's the wrong approach. We've got to look at the whole implications for the networks. I mean, politicians love, and I see Brian Langton here, politicians love to open projects, but it's improvements to the networks that make a difference. And that's the important thing. And I think we've got to stop talking about incrementalism. It'd be interesting to ask the audience, when do you think our licensing and registration system was introduced? In other words, our current road pricing system in New South Wales. When was it introduced? It was introduced in 1928. I think a few things have changed since then, and it is time that we turn that whole system on its head and totally change it dramatically. We are a long way in doing it. As David said, the technology's there. It's particularly there in heavy vehicles. There's no reason why we shouldn't charge a distance, weight-based, proper price for heavy vehicle usage. They do it in New Zealand. They've been doing it in New Zealand for years. And there's no reason why we shouldn't do it here. Unfortunately, there's a lot of lobby groups that don't want us to do it. And that's one of the key issues. There's some winners and losers, as David's pointed out, and people will make this debate very clouded and very complex, unnecessarily so, because they don't want to change it.
All right, there's a couple of good responses there and issues there that we'll get to. Andrew West, let's talk about congestion pricing. We don't want to call it a congestion tax.
Yes,
because
and
we
I
know
absolutely deny ever having used the phrase slugged with a new congestion tax.
But are you in favour of it, and how would you sell it to readers?
Oh, the Herald has editorialised in favour of it, along the lines that David has spoken of, and that is removing the annual on-costs of car ownership. It seems, it's very obvious to people that if you pay $1,200 a year in annual charges, people feel that it's a waste unless they use the car. So we have indeed editorialised on this point. The challenge is that people don't perceive they have a choice. People don't perceive they have a transport choice if they live in an outer suburb. And that's what allows, and I know who David's talking about, it's Alan Jones. That's what allows Alan Jones to sort of demagogue the issue about road user charging, because he raises quite logically the issue of what transport choice do people in areas where there's a very infrequent bus service, if any, what choice do they have? And then you've got questions of changing modes, where you could drive to a hub or somewhere like that and get on a train. Well, a lot of people do that now. One of the reasons for the congestion on the Western Line is that in the absence of the North West Rail line, people are driving to stations like Blacktown and Mount Druitt and boarding trains there.
Whereas they should be getting a bus.
Yes, but the bus services are insufficient. They're not frequent enough. So the question is, the advocates of road user charging, and I acknowledge David is very well informed, an acknowledged expert on this. The challenge is to also to make the case that there will be transport choice. But I strongly support road user charging, absolutely, and I've never called it a congestion tax. And I acknowledge David's point that it's eminently sensible.
Yeah. So is there a way that you can pull forward, is there a way that you can do what we did with water? And now I think most people in the community would acknowledge that, well, yeah, I use more water, so I should pay for it. We have a user pays mentality about that. Why can't we translate that onto, say, the road system?
Well, I think we're almost there with heavy vehicles.
But isn't the real argument to convince
but I think we've got to demonstrate.
Owners?
Heavy vehicles are going to have no impact on the city. Nevertheless, it demonstrates you can do it, and we're almost there. People are now used to, with their tags, used to paying for use of our motorways. So, the concept of actually paying for road space is starting to get into the psyche of people. But we're going to have to, we can't just add it to the existing array of charges. I agree with Andrew. We've got to come back and actually do away with that whole charging system. Yes, you still need vehicles to be registered, and you still need people to have registered licences, but it shouldn't be the fee that it currently is. I mean, we're starting to do it now with insurance, with motor vehicle insurance. You don't just pay a fixed rate now for motor vehicle insurance. It can depend on how much you use your motor vehicle as well. So it is starting to happen, but it will take a very brave politician to introduce this scheme.
All right. David, I just want to ask you a couple of issues, and then I would like to get some questions from the audience, because you're all very engaged in this debate. I'll come at it from somebody who's not been as engaged as many of the experts in this room. If you have road charging, where do you do it in Sydney, and how do you do it to decrease congestion rather than everyone having to slow down to sometimes, which happens at the tollways down at Woolloomooloo, you still have to slow down to 40. So that would seem to slow down traffic. But where do you do it in Sydney? How do you do it?
You do it everywhere. And that includes every single piece of road where clearly the charge would be, if it's the congestion component, would be zero on many of the roads. But you should not selectively do it. And you could drop the tolls on existing toll roads and have a compensation strategy during the current concession period, so they're not worse off. But then you would have a centralised system with to do it, as I indicated, on a distance-based charge with an emissions component and so on. The money that's raised should at least be used as an opportunity to fix up the bottlenecks on the existing network. And there are some key bottlenecks. And we know that if you could knock about 6% of all the traffic off the road network at certain times of the day, you would have no traffic congestion, given the definition of congestion. It doesn't take much. This has been shown in event situations like Olympics, what can be done. The margin is not large. So we're not talking about some massive movement of switch out of the car. On average, I say on average about 6%, but I agree with Helen about the 40-kilometre business, for us poor people that use the M2 at the moment. But having said that, I think that we've got to start seriously using some of this money to have a more uniform speed limit, which currently is suffering because of the lack of a fully integrated road network, where you get some gains and you get some losses because of bottlenecks.
Is there... sorry, Paul, did you want to comment on that?
Just to confirm David's point, during the Olympics, traffic volumes on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which is the main sort of artery of Sydney's road network, were down 12%. And most people thought the bridge was vacant. There was very little traffic on the bridge. 12%. Well, first of all, people talked up the Olympics and said, don't use your motor vehicle, you'll get stuck in traffic. So we sort of
we got people out of their cars. We exaggerated it,
and we said, use public transport, and people did. And so it was 12%. The public transport coped, and admittedly it was school holidays, so you get a natural reduction anyway. But David's right, it's only at the margin. You only need a marginal reduction, and there's a huge improvement in traffic flows.
Is there?
Absolutely.
All right.
Also,
you observe it during school holidays anyway.
Absolutely. A school holiday is a great test. Paul made another good point. There's a huge amount of capacity on the current rail network that's claimed to be not there. It is there. The Olympics showed it.
Andrew, did you want to comment?
Yes, there's up to 30% more capacity on the rail network. I mean, that's a widely acknowledged fact. There's up to 30% more capacity that we could add to the existing railway network through a bit of re-signalling. There is great potential there to achieve a huge uplift in passenger capacity.
All right, we have got a question already from the audience. Have we got a microphone? We'll get that to this gentleman over here. Sir, if you could just say where you're from, if you wouldn't mind. And a question, if there's a statement, I'll have to just cut you short.
Chris Skinner, and I have various affiliations, one of which David and Paul both know well, which is as a visiting lecturer at ITLS. My question for the panel is, do you agree with my vision of 20 years hence, where we will all be experiencing congestion, but it won't be the roads and it won't be any of the other services we take for granted. It will be the wireless spectrum for interconnectivity. In 4 years' time, that is within the term of this current New South Wales government, vehicles will start appearing on this road that can talk to each other using wireless spectrum. There's a very real possibility that in 20 years' time, every vehicle will be so fitted. It will very easily make road charging a fact of life. Telecommunications, after all, is another example along with water. So what does the panel think of that sort of vision?
Thank you. David, do you want to have a go first?
Well, first of all, thank you, Chris. First of all, I think it's going to make the system a lot safer, because the technology will ensure that. At the same time, it could actually generate extra traffic. But I think the assumption underlying Chris's question, I suspect, is that we will by then also have efficient road pricing, so then the congestion issue will be less of an issue. But I don't see the technology as a panacea. I see it as an input.
Andrew, did you want to have a comment?
I don't know enough about it, and I've learned in 20 years to limit comment on things I don't know enough about. So no, I don't know enough about that issue.
And I'll take Andrew's line.
It's an interesting point, though, isn't it? One thing I wanted to raise, and I still bring you questions, I'll get to yours in a minute, ma'am. If Singapore and London has started doing it, and maybe they're not doing it completely yet, but this, back to the charging, because I think this is the central issue, one of the central issues that you raised, David. If they're doing it, has it resulted in lower congestion? Do we know how to measure whether it's been successful?
The answer is definitely yes. but it's got to be tempered by the fact that if you do it in one location only, there's some impacts across the network in terms of where you just transfer the problem.
Yeah.
So, and in Singapore, although it's not official yet, but in my capacity as an advisor, we recommended that they roll it out to the entire island. The entire island of Singapore is about the same size as the Sydney metropolitan area. The minister's very much in favour of this, but time will tell.
Okay. Ma'am, did you have a question? We'll just get the microphone to you if you could just identify where you're from.
Good morning. Gail Broadbent from the Australian Conservation Foundation. Just to throw something into the air, fuel excise could be considered as a possible alternative to raise funds for public transport improvements, and you would be doing that across the board because that's an Australian federal tax. Do you see that there's a problem with raising, changing the fuel, the road pricing
charging
regime here in New South Wales if the other states don't do it, because you might get complaints about lack of competition with the states? Do you think this is something that would have to be approached Australia-wide, and if so, do you see problems there?
Thank you.
Well, I'm talking only about the Sydney metropolitan area at this stage, although I'd imagine it'd be great one day that the whole island is doing this. But I including Tasmania, by the way. But I have to say that the big challenge we face is if we're going to look at fuel excise as an alternative, is this whole hypothecation area. But let me also make the other point. I think if we did this the way I'm suggesting, the productivity of the urban economy would increase substantially. And we are through the Director General of Transport, currently working to identify the wider economy benefits of improvements in the transport system. And there's no doubt about it that there could be up to 50 or 60% additional productivity gains by actually doing something about traffic congestion. So that would put Sydney, and including its port, at a much more competitive advantage, not just within Australia, but also within the region. And that's a very, very important issue. So I'm not going to pussyfoot around and say, well, we mustn't do it because we'll offend Victoria. They don't care if they offend us.
Okay. As was mentioned before, we have great pleasure in having the Japanese Consul General here, Dr. Kahara. And I did ask him beforehand if he wouldn't mind if I sort of single him out and ask him a question. So we might get the microphone to Dr. Kahara here. Firstly, we are very much thinking of Japan after the devastating earthquake and the tsunami, and our sympathies and thoughts very much go with you. And I think many Australians, most Australians, are still thinking of Japan. But having said that, usually we go to Japan and look for the ideas there. Many of us love your bullet train. Many of us want a bullet train here, that sort of thing. But sticking to the topic that we're talking about today, which is not about very fast trains across the country, can I ask you, are you intrigued by what you're hearing today? Maybe taking that back to Japan?
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting me to this quite exciting breakfast meeting. Yes, it's my son, he attends the University of Sydney to learn architecture, city planning now. We enjoyed very much discussion today. And also we love Sydney. We enjoy lives in Sydney. But I know you all know Sydney has, I think, need to introduce more public transport system. If you have a chance to visit Japan, or you have already visited Japan, for instance, Tokyo is a very big metropolitan city, 10 million population. It's a very busy city, but it's very efficient because we have very efficient public transport system. In particular, the subway system, for instance, in terms of connectivity and frequency. For instance, every 3 minutes, we have a very safe and punctual railway train system. And I think it's very necessary for Sydney to introduce such a mass transit or public transport system. And I believe today's discussion will contribute to do so. Whenever I go back to Tokyo, even I, Japanese, got lost in the very highly developed subway system because it's so much network, and I hope we can share such experience in the process of introducing a public transport system in Sydney. So thank you so much for your great and generous support to the people affected in the disaster. Recently, Prime Minister Julia Gillard visited Japan, and she visited the disaster-stricken area in northern part of Japan. She encouraged the people affected, and we really felt a sense of solidarity with Australian people. So on this occasion, I would like to say thank you again, and I really enjoy the discussion. I hope it certainly will have less congestion by introducing public transportation system, and in the future, I hope bread train system is introduced from Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kihara. So, Andrew, I might actually throw to you. Sure. I know you've written a fair bit on rail, and of course, there's all different sorts of rail systems. But I think, as a normal user of rail, a commuter, most people here, love the rapid transport rail system, the subway in Tokyo, in Paris, even in London.
Even in London.
Yes. Right. Are we past that point where we think about that for Sydney?
No, not at all. But
because it's too expensive, or
no. And look, I just want to. We talked a lot about road pricing, and I acknowledge that's a key issue. In answering this question, I want to address David's point that he raises about the debate over road-based bus rapid transit and heavy rail. There's got to be a place for both. I do not think it is politically possible, nor I think is it desirable, to refashion the existing plans that the state government has for a heavy rail system to the northwest and to the southwest, and to a system that joins the missing link between Epping and Parramatta. For a start, too much has been staked politically for the new government on those projects.
So that's going to happen.
But there's also the question of desirability. I just cannot conceive, and I acknowledge and respect David's expertise in this enormously, but I just cannot conceive of developments in the northwest and the southwest where you're going to have cities basically of 300,000 people without some form of fixed rail to support that population. The second point is, though, it goes to the kind of city we want. Heavy rail and light rail corridors create a certain ambience and development opportunities. Now, you can get some of these around bus rapid transit, but internationally, urban planners tend to agree that you need a form of fixed rail transport to get your densities and to encourage desirable forms of development. Now, there is place, I think, for extensive bus rapid transit joining the centres in Western Sydney, and WESROC, the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils, has made this point about the desperate need to join the regions, Parramatta or Penrith and Liverpool, for example. Yes. And that, I think, is the great breakthrough that can be made with bus rapid transit.
All right, David, do you want to respond to that?
Indeed, I would like to. I think 2 points. Andrew might use the word fixed, which is good enough for me, because BRT is a fixed, high-capacity, dedicated corridor lookalike rail system. But I would just like to quote something. I've just written a piece for the Sun Herald, which is something together with Nick Greiner on advice or commentary on where his agenda might go. And I've written it in 2 ways. And the second part was to do based on the constraint that we are going to build 2 railways. The other part was the nicer part. But and as I say, if, as is likely, we're already constrained by 2 very expensive rail projects, then the network approach should still be proceeded with to ensure that these large projects do not hinder the needs to provide coverage and connectivity for all of Sydney where it can make a difference.
So you're saying both together, really?
Well, because of the political reality.
Yeah. Paul, did you want to have a comment about that?
I do actually, and I'll have a go at Andrew here. I think it's about time the press realised that these new corridors, new parts of the network, take time to build up patronage. For example, when Liverpool to Parramatta bus-only transitway was developed, the RTA got a real caning in the press as building a white elephant. Yes, people were not used to that, and if you look at David's sort of change in behaviour sort of graph, people took a while to get used to it. But every month, that patronage level grew and grew and grew. The same for the Blacktown to Rouse Hill bus-only transitway. It takes time for people to adjust. It takes time for people to build up patronage. And I think the media's got to give people a bit of a break when these sort of things are first tried.
All right. When I don't travel
on...
on...
It didn't get a caning from me. May have got a caning from some people at the Telegraph or
and the Herald.
It may well have done, but it didn't get a... I mean, we are absolutely committed to the expansion. We undertook, a 6-month independent inquiry headed by the former roads and rail boss, Ron Christie, and he came up with solutions that included bus rapid transit as well. So we're absolutely committed to a mixture of both. I'm just saying it's a question of how you want to shape the city as well. And David's right. Bus rapid transit is a fixed route, but around the world, when I look at the development patterns, you don't get the same intensity of development that you do around rail.
Go ahead, David.
Well, that's a controversial topic because there's been a lot of fabrication out there by the rail lobby.
We've got about 1 minute on that, and then we want to talk about a few other...
We've even had property developers building apartments to show that railways create development, and that's actually a fabrication of the causality. Having said that, fortunately, we are the recipients of a major grant with MIT and a group in Portugal and so on to study BRT over the next 5 years. And actually the evidence on this issue is actually, the jury is still out, I must admit. I think the strong link between property development and public transport is controversial, but I have to say it's the fixity and the continuity of the investment that drives the agenda, not whether it's a bus or a train. And then I remind you, we had a thing called the Bondi trams here many years ago. They've gone, and it was often said to me, the great thing about a railway or light rail, you can't take it away, but you can take buses away. It's absolute rubbish.
All right.
Helen, one very quick comment on Andrew, and I agree with him this time. This debate is all about how we want our city to function. It shouldn't be looked at role pricing in isolation. It's all about how we want our cities to grow.
And I guess it shouldn't be about, one interest protecting its little patch and another interest protecting its little patch. We need to actually have not another transport plan, as David said, but one that's a vision, I suppose.
And part of it is, if you see David's graph again about long-term behavioural change, a lot of it's about containment as well in the long term. In other words, people living close to where they work, so they haven't got to cross the city from one end to the other. And the right pricing signals will in fact encourage that to happen.
All right, that dedicated line that you were talking about, the bus from, was it Penrith to Liverpool?
Liverpool to Parramatta.
Yes, to Parramatta. Does that bottleneck at certain points, or does it have a straight run through, no competition with any cars?
Well, it has a straight run through, except it obviously crosses lots of roads, but it has priority at the traffic lights.
Okay. Gentleman down here at the far table, could we just have a brief question?
So I'm Glenn Gears from NICTA. Just a comment about David's comment there about trams getting rid of light rail. You can. Sydney got rid of it in 1961, and I think we had the largest tram network in the world at that time, which would have been a good basis for a PRT, effectively. And if you look around the road system, you'll see various parades where the corridors are still there for trams. The other question, of course, getting back to road pricing now, is equity is one thing in transport that always comes up in discussions like this. Have you considered means testing road pricing? Because of the geography of Sydney, unfortunately, people of lower incomes tend to live further away, and Mr. Scrooge, who drives his Bentley up the road to his brokerage, but his cleaner comes from Penrith. How do you ensure that Mr. Scrooge pays equitably to Mr. Average from Penrith, who's his cleaner?
Maybe Mr. Scrooge has the big gas-guzzling car, so he'll still be got at. Who wants to have a go at that?
Well, I think the best answer, it's a good point and it's an important point, and the equity issue is important, but I think what I would like to do is to stop using it as an excuse to get in the way of doing anything. I think we've got to get an efficient charging regime, and then we've got to look at equity compensation packages to sort this out. And the trouble is, at the moment, the two have got so confused we do nothing.
Another question over at that back table. Yes.
Hello, working. Hi. Dean Economou, also from NICTA. David, but the rest of the panel as well, you said that the privacy issues on road user pricing had been largely dealt with, and I'd be fascinated to hear how that has been done.
The main comment is I think the experience we've had with electronic tolling, you discuss around the world that the biggest concern was people divulging the mechanism for payment and having access to their accounts and so on. People in Sydney have been quite willing to do that. Now, there is the pre and post strategies on that, and we did a study a few years ago for Transurban actually that showed there is a class of people that are still opposed to all these payment mechanisms, and they're normally the elderly or the techno non-savvy. I think the majority of the population, as time goes by, is quite accepting of that because we're quite happy to hand over our credit cards for almost anything on the internet these days, especially given the current exchange rate. So I think you'll find that this is all aiding to sort this out. I see little debate in Australia on this compared with some countries that are late in the piece. And Australia leads the world in fully interoperable tolling, by the way. We did it a long time before anybody else throughout the country, and I think that's helped to reduce the barriers.
Also, if you look at your e-tag account, it shows you what roads you use and the time of day you use them. It's great for tracking your kids, I've got to say.
You're still paying for their e-tolls, yeah?
No, I abolished that 6 months ago.
Yes.
So just a part B to that, sorry. So the e-tags are very specific locations, you know where they are, but to do proper road pricing, you really need to track the vehicles everywhere so you can pay for the infrastructure appropriately. And I think it's that pervasive knowledge of where your car is and that you're driving it that might be the issue. And if you've got any comment on that, I'd also be very interested.
It's an interesting issue, isn't it? And I guess, you know, I mean, other services might be interested in that information too. For instance, the police. Well, we know they've used mobile phones to track where people are and supposedly track where people are. Is that a concern still, David, or do you think you can, you know, those sorts of things can be worked out once we still have a commitment to do this?
I'm confident they can be worked out. It's not been on the radar for a long time as an issue in the debate on road pricing, in Australia at least. I take the point. It is something not to ignore, but I don't see it as a predominant concern.
Does the panel think that perhaps the new government is on board with this, or because they're going to, you know, we think, honour their commitments for the rail line, northwest and southwest, that road pricing won't come up? David, where do you think you're at politically, or do you think you've got to win over the hearts and minds of the community before the politicians will come on board?
Yes, you've got to sell it to the constituencies before the politicians will come on board. But I know that the current government is showing interest in keeping informed as to what are the opportunities. But my feeling at this stage is that this is not a high priority issue for the current government.
Maybe it should be, Paul.
I think David's right. This is why a forum like this is so useful. We've got to encourage this debate and inform public debate about these issues. This is going to take a long time to do, but nevertheless there's a strong rational argument as to why it should be done. But we need to have more and more forums like this. We need to get more and more of the interest groups involved in that sort of discussion. And once there's lower political risk, I think then you've got a chance that the politicians will then start to move on it.
Andrew, what's your view about this?
I think it's more likely that there could be some experiment in the city, given that such a small proportion, relatively small proportion of commuters come to the city by car. So I think there's some possibility that the government, maybe in its second term, may experiment with road user charging in the CBD. But I acknowledge David's point that, yeah, the public support needs to be won. And again, I emphasise, I think that's possible where you show and demonstrate that people in outer suburbs have a transport choice.
Yes.
Then I think it's a much easier sell. So I think the long-term prospects are rather good, but I think the medium-term prospects of maybe some CBD-based experiment are, feasible.
All right, well, by my watch, it's coming up to 5 to 9, and we promised to have you out of here by 9. I just wondered, were there a couple more questions from the floor? 1, 2, and this lady, you go first because you've already had a turn, so a quick question, please.
Quickly, your comment on control of parking as an alternative mechanism for controlling traffic within the CBD.
It's not an alternative, it's a complement.
Yes, this gentleman here, if you just identify where you're from, sir.
Frank Milthorpe, Bureau of Transport Stats. If it's not the politicians that are going to lead this debate, who should be leading this debate with the community?
All of you, obviously. Get onto your friendly journalists and push it if you believe in it. Paul, do you want to have a go at that?
I think you've got to cover off all stakeholders in this sort of debate, and the challenge is going to be to bring those stakeholders with you at each stage. Because a lot of the stakeholders, have a particular vested interest and will push that for a while, but they can quickly flip around and be totally against it. So, don't underestimate the challenge of these sorts of changes. But, we just can't continue, I believe, to have this incremental approach to things. We need a total step change, and this is what this provides.
My only comment is we need to debate it in the right language.
Yep. But it's also already happening. There's a broad coalition. Gail Broadbent from the ACF put together a very strong coalition. I believe Daryl Mellish from the bus association, Alex Klassen, who's here from the RTBU, they're all part of a broad coalition designed to achieve better public transport outcomes. So I think once you get that kind of very effective coalition with people of the professional standing of Daryl and Alex and Gail, I think you're more than halfway there.
So the experts, I guess, and perhaps the stakeholders, as Paul mentioned, need to get together, talk about it, and then I guess the media conversation will happen.
And they're not just experts. These people speak for very significant sectors of the industry and the community.
Yeah, the stakeholders. There was another question right here, sir. Yes.
I have a loud voice.
And then one last one here.
From the RTA. Gentlemen, when you were having a little debate about buses and rail, what I didn't hear for myself an either-or argument. What I heard was different solutions for different places and needs and for different times, which suggests, notwithstanding the emphasis on a network, that corridors can be locations where the mode provided changes over time. Sorry for the long lead-in, but my question is about what institutional structures, in terms of the challenges facing the public service in this town, what institutional structures for transport planning and delivery of projects and decision-making have you seen in your travels that you think are up to that challenge of integrated and staged planning to deliver different solutions at different times?
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Matt. He's one of our graduates, and it's wonderful to have such an articulate question. And I have to totally agree with him that the greatest barrier in many ways is institutional. And it does come down to institutions still being in modal. We're hoping with the new Integrated Transport Authority we'll try and break those barriers down, but you won't break them down unless you have a change of view of the individuals in those organisations. It's no good just redefining the concept if the people still think the same. So you're spot on about that, and that is a real big concern, and if we can only get away from the modal bias in some sense, we're making progress. But it is a challenging issue, and I think that it's one that we don't have an obvious solution to. But I have to say, I think education and people attending groups like ITLS's programs through the business school start to get a better understanding as to where the focus should be. And I remember many years ago when we did a stakeholder study, it was suggested that we don't even have a transport department or a department of planning, we have a department of accessibility. It didn't work. Too ambitious.
One final question down this end, sir.
Hello, Peter Jones, MBA alumni and road user consumer, not an expert, but I'm currently paying, based on my extensive calculations, somewhere between $32.50 and $45 a day for an 8-kilometre, 18-minute commute in Sydney during peak hour. I'm really interested in this 6% reduction in traffic and how we can achieve that in a short time frame so we can get some of the benefits and start to, I guess, share the benefits around the whole community. What's your short-term wins that will get us along that path.
Yes, David?
I thought Paul was saying something.
Oh,
No. Matt said something. He said ride a bike.
Well, why don't you switch mode if there's an alternative? But no, that's not a fair comment. But what we're doing now, we're using as a proxy congestion management. In other words, we're using the congestion to allocate space, which is not a good outcome because it's not really working very well. I don't think there is a short-term solution other than we've got to start announcing some serious plans to allow people to pay what they should pay. But having said that, I mean, it could be related to land use activity and the whole issue of spread of working hours and things like that. There's one issue that I found has a huge influence, and it's partly taking place, and that's distributed work hours. And that's what we're actually doing now. So if you can actually travel at 5 in the morning, you'll avoid the problem. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm serious. I now actually have increasingly, every year I'm beginning 15 minutes earlier. But it's amazing how I can adapt to that and cope. And I find the benefits are worth it until such times as we have proper pricing. But I think your $45 will be less. That doesn't include loss of time, of course. Exactly, and I suspect if you're doing the MBA, you're earning a lot. But but I think we can improve on the $45 for you by looking at the optimal price.
Paul, did you want to have a go at that, or you fine? Okay. Final last question. This lady has had her hand up for a while, so go ahead.
Hi, Ulrike Immer from IECOM. First of all, great presentation and good discussion. I might have a solution to the last question, which is also a question to the panel actually. What role can cycling play in relieving some of the congestion? Like looking at the European cities where we've actually got incentive schemes for cycling to work.
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. Who wants to have a go at that? Andrew?
Well, there's already a huge investment in cycling. I think it's in inner city areas. I think it's a really popular mode that's taken off. There needs to be a lot more cyclists to justify the investment. The only thing I would say that cyclists should not be in the bus lane. They should not be in the bus lane. I have no problem with cyclists holding up a line of single occupant cars. They should not be holding up a line of buses jammed with 60 people each.
All right. I think we've opened.
They should not be in the bus lanes.
I think we've opened a good future discussion point there. Unfortunately, we have run out of time now, but I can see you're all sitting in your seats, so maybe we should keep this going. But no, we did promise that we could be finished by 9 o'clock, and I think, we're right on 9 o'clock. So, look, I do want you to thank our guests today, Andrew West from the Sydney Morning Herald, Paul Forward from Evans and Peck, and of course Professor David Hensher from the ITLS at the University of Sydney. Please thank them for their insights. Thank you, David.